welcome President Cooper, humanics professors, faculty, students, staff, community members. I am Judy Van Ralt, professor of psychology and your 2019-2020 humanics professor, and I am delighted to welcome you to this humanics triathlon event. Thank you for coming out on a Tuesday night at 7:30, and for some of you right after practice and right around other events that you have going on. Now is a great time to turn on your SuperFanU app and log in so you can earn spirit points for your involvement and connection to the humanics triathlon. So that's something that if that whole thing was surprising to you, go to your humanics triathlon website and find out how your spirit in coming to events like this and other things on campus can be counted for the humanics triathlon. The humanics triathlon this year also includes mind events like the lecture tonight and body events that you'll create yourself through the humanics challenge, hopefully sharing with the campus community and uploading to the humanics triathlon website the things you're doing to enrich your community, your campus, and yourselves. The selection of our first humanics triathlon speaker was inspired in part by psychology professor Dr. Seth Arsenian, the college's first humanics professor, approximately, 50 years ago in 1969, not necessarily today though. Dr. Arsenian wrote the book, Humanics and Higher Education, a Psychological Interpretation. And he turned attention and awareness to the importance of spirit, mind, and body from a psychological perspective. Dr. Parham, who's joining us here tonight, has shown a commitment to spirit, mind, and body, as well as to community throughout his career. He is a board-certified psychologist, teacher, scholar, practitioner, administrator, and director of the National Basketball Players Association Mental Health and Wellness Program. If I were to discuss his credentials tonight, you wouldn't get to hear his talk, and so I'm going to turn things over to him without further ado. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Good. Thank you for participating in what I hope will be a stimulating conversation. I want to thank Springfield College for the warm reception and the day full of activity. I really enjoy anytime I can participate with colleagues and students in advancing what I believe is an important conversation and a conversation that is long overdue. I've entitled the presentation, "The Ink Used to Indelibly Etch Lasting Impressions, Invisible Tattoos of Trauma Within Athletic Communities," and I'm going to expand upon that a little bit more. One of the messages I hope to get across is that there are far more athletes walking around hurting than you can imagine. I will make some inferences with some data that we will show that would suggest there are some of you, well, not you, I understand from my colleagues that this is the perfect audience, so some of your friends may resonate with some of the material that I will be presenting. So I just want to be real clear about that what we're talking about is mental health and wellness of people played out in the context of athletics. So with that in mind, permit me to keep moving forward. I have a number of invitations that I want you to consider. One is that mental health and wellness challenges in professional athletics is really a human challenge. Again, that is played out in the context of professional sports. That's so important because so many people think that there's athlete mental health. and that when you start breaking that down, that there's something different in the athletic community that separates their mental health and wellness from non-athletes. I'm wanting you to consider that that simply is not accurate. That the mental health and wellness that you see in the demographics in the general population is exactly what you will see in professional sports. A distinguishing feature is that we'll get in later, there are many factors that prevent the athletic community from really expressing overtly what they are struggling with. A second invitation to consider is that professional sports has absolutely not failed at responding meaningfully and substantively to the mental health and wellness challenges of athletes. Rather, professional sports have succeeded at not responding to athlete mental health and wellness. And I want to just invite you to think about what I'm inviting you to consider. Because a lot of times when something isn't going well, when there is a social ill, there's always a tendency, in my opinion, knee-jerk, to say and to conclude that the system has failed. And while that intuitively makes sense, it is an observation around which we all can rally. It places artificial responsibility on the wrong person. I clinically, and as a professor, never invite my students to assume failure. They, in fact, succeed. And there's two directions in which you can succeed. Succeed at really moving forward and getting on with your life, or holding on to issues and struggles. So again, I propose, just for you to think about, the athletic community historically has succeeded at not addressing issues that have been there forever. Third, addressing mental health and wellness challenges in professional sports represents an investment in the overall health and well-being of the athletes, not anything other than an investment. You see, the common belief is that, particularly in the professional athletic community, that if you begin to give athletes an opportunity to talk about their baggage, to really talk about their problems, what you are in fact doing is opening up Pandora's box to compromise talent expression. It's important to understand that there's no evidence on planet Earth to support that, but it is in fact believable. And one of the notions and cornerstones that serves as the foundation of the program we started a year and a half ago, the first in professional sports, is that if in fact athletes, professional ballers, are playing at Hall of Fame levels, carrying around a lot of baggage that I know that they are carrying, what if we could provide a place in the space for them to let some of that go and to begin a process of healing earlier? How much more we would see in the expression of their talent. I'm going to talk more about that with some examples. The last one is that when you change the way you think about things, and the things you think about change. So I'm inviting you to consider that as reframing is a skill that's going to be very important in the work that we're about to do. So let's take a look at the bigger picture. Given the context and constraints within which elite athletes function, for the most part, athletes are very healthy physically and psychologically. And what does that mean? That they invest in developing and maintaining healthy practices relative to responding to family, friends, occupational, social, financial, and spiritual domains. So all of the areas of their life, they're doing quite well. Feeling empowered, having strong agency that they are able to conduct their affairs in a way that makes sense. 2, inevitable challenges are responded to with a sense of agency relative to problem assessment, strategic planning for short and long-term success. So they anticipate that challenges are going to emerge, but they have a calmness about assessing where does this fit in the large scheme, what strategies can I use to get to the next step, and how to implement the strategies. The last thing I'll say on here is that they make decisions to not take themselves too seriously. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And there's actually a lot of scholarship on this last point. Because when you are over-involved in who you are versus what you are doing, then that can be part of the issue. So if you continue, these next two slides I'm just going to whiz through, and it's not as important if you look at it, but when you look at, there's only in the NBA, the organization with which I'm affiliated, and I'm actually affiliated directly with the National Basketball Players Association, which is the union. But within the league, there's only 450 active ballers in the NBA. About 1,700 active players in the NFL, 750 to 1,200 depending on who you cite in Major League Baseball. Major League Soccer, 460,000 in NCAA. The Olympics, 144 women in the WNBA. And this is, again, active and then both international athletes for the NCAA, but also in professional athletics. I say all that to say that there are numbers that are important. Some would argue in comparative numbers that the athlete community is very small. Professional athletes have a moniker that they are spoiled, that they're rich, and what problems could they possibly have? The average public doesn't have a clue as to what's really going on. So I go on record to saying a couple things. First, I want you to consider is this, that many athletes and many of the challenges that they are facing actually go unaddressed for most of their athletic careers. Unaddressed meaning they allow them to sort of fester. Some of them aren't even aware that they're going on. So let's take a look at Junior Seau, for example, who was a professional baller, Hall of Fame football player, ultimately suicided. What happened, and I won't get into the NFL and the CTE dilemma, but after a long history of head banging, there's a lot of trauma associated with the brain. That problem has been going on for a long time in the NFL. What happened with Junior Seau and others is that when they suicided, they specifically did not shoot themselves in the head. They shot themselves in the heart, leaving intact a brain that under dissection they could really clearly see the CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy to the brain. It was as a result of that and many others who've gone on record. But understand that he was in his 40s when all of this happened. Paul Oliver, another suicide. Clark Carlisle, depression. Wade Bellick in hockey, suicide. Claire Hughes, Olympic cyclist and speed skater, her struggles with depression. John Madden, famous coach. Michael Phelps. In the NBA, you've heard a lot about Kevin Love, DeMar DeRozan, Kelly Oubre. What you haven't heard much about, although other than the Larry Nassar, is USA Gymnastics. And I will cite a little bit more of that story later on in the presentation. But a lot of these situations and people are going on right in front of you. And we are caught up in the entertainment of it all, the excitement, the competition. Rightly so, it's an escape. It's a legitimate form of entertainment. But we focus so much on the performer and not the person. And one of my takeaway messages tonight is that I think it's important to begin focusing on the person before the performer. Let's take a look at a few other notable persons and professional athletes. Anybody heard of Jerry West? Yes? No? Yeah. Interact. I can.
Yeah.
Yes? Very good. All right. Has anybody ever seen the logo of the NBA?
Yeah.
Yes.
You know who that is?
Yeah.
Yes, the logo of Jerry West. Hall of Famer. Deep from Cabin Creek, West Virginia. If you read his book, West on West, My Charmed and Tormented Life, you will see that he struggled with depression mightily. So the very logo of the NBA is calling you to pay attention. When you look at Keon Dooley, a colleague of mine, very dear friend, we are putting this program together. He's a 13-year basketballer in the NBA, former Hall. 13 years is significant because about 4 to 5, 6 years is an average life of a basketball player. He lasted 13 years. The story that he talks about and goes on tour talking about his healing is what drives you, how I overcame abuse and learned to lead in the NBA. And essentially what his story was, he had just signed a multi-million-dollar contract with the Boston Celtics, arguably one of the more storied franchises in the history of professional basketball. He was across the United States on the West Coast doing some philanthropy work. Went inside to use the men's room, and an inebriated fan came and groped him on the behind. And he flipped out. Really became overwhelmed with what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. He was so shaken by that event. He went back to Danny Ainge, general manager of the Boston Celtics, said, I can't do this anymore. Gave up $1 million contract and checked himself into a psychiatric facility, full-on psychiatric hospital for 4 days. He subsequently was discharged, went on a journey of healing and therapy. And what surfaced is that he was sexually molested at age 6. So his first death by a gang shooting at age 10. Never told anybody, but carried that around and did what we know most survivors do with trauma, is make a childhood pact to oneself and to future others in your circle that I will never position you or me to be in this sort of vulnerability in the future. He was so committed to that, he disciplined himself, mastered the craft of basketball, was an all-star baller at the University of Missouri, Columbia, made it to be a first-round draft pick in the NBA, 10th overall, and had a very successful career. All the time, nobody really knowing what was going on with him. And his story is not unique. Metta World Peace, somebody I've known for many years, Defensive Player of the Year in 2004, won his first world champion in 2010. Heck of a baller. But he also has a book out, No Malice, My Life in Basketball, or how a kid from Queensbridge survived the streets, the brawls, and himself to become an NBA champion. He was so enamored with going to therapy once he really needed to get his head clear. He acknowledged publicly that he had gone to see a therapist, and he donated his championship ring to a mental health cause. He really puts his money where his mouth is, and continues to this day putting on presentations and stimulating discussion around the importance of mental health and well-being. So what I've done here is just put up a non-exhaustive list of mental health challenges that athletes struggle with. What I hope that you see, there's not one struggle up there that the general population doesn't struggle with. But again, because of the context of sport, they simply do not have the same permission to engage and to wrestle with their issues. They have a number of lived experiences that that non-athletes don't have to contend with. There's an enormous amount of pressure from family and friends to support them, and not only to support them, but to continue the support ad infinitum. I can't tell you how many players I've talked to When they first get into the league, all of a sudden, they have relatives they've never heard of. And some of them have relatives that aren't actually relatives. But they have best friends that pop up and everybody trying to get a piece of where they're going and want to ride their coattails. They also struggle with managing and subsequently responding to their identity as a player. So they get used to be calling their name in lights and the neon. The fans cheering, that feels exhilarating. That feels wonderful. They feel real connected to that. So when the fans stop cheering, that's a real resounding message of something else major is going on in my life. They lack skills to make successful transitions to life and career for non-athletes. Not all of them, but that's a fair issue. Most athletes who come in at 18 to 20 now out of college with the inevitable, I'm invincible, these bad things will never happen to me. Yet if you imagine even ballers such as Kobe Bryant, a distinguished baller, Hall of Famer, will be entered in the Hall of Fame, I predict, first time ballot. He has a 20-year career. He's 42 years old. So he has a long time left to live. So imagine guys who are getting out after 10 years, after 5 years. What are they going to do? Well, that's a real big journey. What you also hear from ballers, particularly when their fans stop cheering, is the loss of camaraderie and fraternity. They really see themselves as a fraternity. And the love and the respect and the passion they have for the game and for each other, even though they may be on opposing teams. See, because a lot of these ballers have grown up together. Played against in college, even before that in AAU circuit. And so they are quite taken with each other. They have built up a friendship, a long-lasting brotherhood that in fact plays itself out. So when you no longer have it, that can be quite distressing. So I want you to just keep all of that in mind, and I want to shift to a notion that even though there's no obvious and overt display that there's something going on, I want to introduce the notion of the smoke detector. Now, how many of you, let me see a show of hands, have a smoke detector in your residence? And if you went home right now, calm and relaxed, opened your door, and your smoke detector was going off, I doubt very seriously that any of you would get a step stool, take the smoke detector down, and go get it fixed. You see, the fact that it went off suggests that it's working. And it's really letting you know you need to come pay attention. What we see in professional sports are expressions of smoke detector behavior. So when you really see players struggling with interpersonal struggles against with their partners, with their children, intrapersonal struggles within themselves, when you see business relationships, when you see alcohol and substance use problems, and the list goes on, those are smoke detectors. So the media is full of stories. There's run-ins with the law, spousal and partner battery, anger outbursts on and off the court, alcohol and substance-related challenges, infidelity, struggles with gambling, anxieties, phobias, associated airplane flights, struggles with financial mismanagement. All of those, again, on the surface appear maybe as simple issues that they need to adjust to. And for most of these, there in fact may be an occasional evidence that this is not really as big as it appears. But I also want you to understand that these are smoke detector behaviors, and lo and behold, there's always something behind that message. When you see a basketball player who all of a sudden goes into a slump, or for that matter, any professional athlete, the intervention there is not to teach him how to shoot. The issue isn't how to teach them how then to relax and to concentrate and focus. Those are not unuseful interventions. But unless you get a sense of what is really making the smoke detector come on, they aren't going to be receptive to those interventions, because essentially what you're doing is coming up with a smoke screen over the smoke detector. and not really dealing with what the real issue might be. So what we also see, when you look at it broadly, there are a number of athletes who struggle with sexual identity that never come out until their career is finished. One of the Collins twins is an example. If you read the recent book by the brother of Aaron Hernandez, NFL player who was found dead, you can say it that way, it was said. His brother reports a struggle with his sexual identity his entire career, on top of a lot of other issues. But those sorts of struggles you don't often see. I go on record as saying, well, let me not say that to the wrong camera, so let me just keep going. But these are just a few of the other folks in this category. Again, Jason Collins, Michael Sam, boxer Orlando Cruz, soccer player Robbie Rogers, Martina Navratilova, tennis, and she's been out for a long time. And essentially, whether sports world works, all of these folks are incentivized to be private and quiet. So knowing that, I want you to really think about this whole notion of invisible tattoos. And for any of you who have tattoos, in fact, how many of you in here may have a tattoo if you feel comfortable raising your hand? Whoa, about half of you. All right. Does the tattoo hurt when you put it on, or it gets put on you? Do some of you, particularly guys, feel like crying and wincing? I know you try to be tough, but it hurts. And for anybody, it's quite painful, depending on the size and complexity. You can get a tattoo delivered and inked in stages, days, hours per session. And it'd be quite agonizing depending on the part of the body. But essentially what you hear every minute that's on is bzzz, the drill injecting ink under your skin, following a pattern, and it stings, it hurts. And I want you to really just get a hold of that image. Because what we're talking about, invisible tattoos, is really related to trauma. I'm going to show a study in a moment. It really talks about the trauma that I'm talking about. But in short, trauma is a deeply personal, uniquely nuanced, intricately emotional, and violent proprioceptive interruption. Proprioception is awareness of space, person, place, and time, of a person's physical, psychological, and existential being. Traumatic experiences can't be unseen, unfelt, or unremembered. Every emotion that surfaces, not the collection of emotions, every emotion that surfaces represents an inkwell from life's well that gets etched into one's soul and one's spirit, marking the horrific event that occurred. Getting back to Keon Dooley, I can't begin to imagine the range of feelings that a 6-year-old was experiencing at the time. Because most single-digit age kids do not have the cognitive sophistication or emotional intelligence to really grapple with what's going on. At some level, they know it's not right. But it's hard. There is an indelible etching right there. When he saw his first shooting in the streets of South Florida, that's an etching right there. And those things never, never go away. Evident in his story, he had a successful career, so there's the illusion that everything is good. Out of the blue, and who would have thought in a public restroom what happened would have happened. And so what happened, it released all of that stuff that he'd been carrying around. If he walked in here today, he's a wonderful man, married, wonderful family, really gifted in his presentation and delivering a message of healing. but it really took him to go through that journey to be the prolific speaker that he is. So this next point is that traumatic experiences often exhaust the interpersonal resources and self-protective boundaries used as tailored safeguards when responding to life's ups and downs. But what we also know is that this is keenly distressing. And as I mentioned, each experience and each emotion represents the ink that etches that invisible tattoo. And as evident in Keon's case, an athlete's apparent survival and successful integration of their past and personal into athletic success should not be interpreted as evidence that their invisible tattoos of trauma have been erased. Nothing could be further from the truth. So the point here is that there are a lot of athletes, many of whom that you know, are walking around with issues of trauma. What I want to do is add this before we get to the actual data is the assault and the wounds, the element of collusion. Collusion in athletes represents a relational experiences of betrayal by secret pacts, goal-directed to cheating, lying, deceiving, and take advantage of more vulnerable prey using real or perceived power to humiliate and intimidate. I need you to understand that, because when you start looking at collusion in athletics, you really begin to see three pieces here. Collusion continues because it's held loosely accountable for their actions, that is, the perpetrators, that they are motivated to find and manipulate systemic loopholes, and they are fueled by a higher octane win-at-all-cost ambition. So when you put that formula together, you begin to see the systematic collusion in USA Gymnastics. Story of Larry Nassar that I hope all of you are familiar with. His abuse of those young ladies went on for years. And for you to believe that nobody knew about it, I invite you to think differently. When you look at Penn State, arguably one of the more storied collegiate football programs in the United States, Jerry Sandusky molesting boys. And for you to believe that nobody knew about it, including Joe Paterno, I'd invite you to really do some more thinking. Because the salt in the wound that I'm referring to actually stings when you think of the trauma of the actual perpetrator and the knowledge that the system around him is supporting them to perpetrate violence. That's the salt in the wound that never feels good. There are many examples, sometimes weekly if not monthly, of coach-athlete abuse in youth, college, and professional sports. That's not uncommon. But for a lot of reasons, athletes don't have the same permission to talk about those journeys. So what I want to get into is some data that I want all of you to really consider, which frames part of what I'm talking about here. There was a classic study done in 1996 to 1998 by the Center for Disease Control in Kaiser Permanente. It was called the ACE study. Close to 18,000 patients looking at childhood experiences and their current health status. Two things I want to bring to your attention. First is the ACE pyramid. What this tells us, based on 18,000 patients, the bottom of the pyramid, you see adverse childhood experiences, the trauma that they endured. That, in fact, leads to disrupted neural development, so the formation of the brain and the child development. That leads to social, emotional, cognitive impairment, which leads to the adoption of health risk behavior. which leads to disease, disability, and social problems, and in the end, early death. 18,000 patients, so that's not a small sample. I'll go through this real quickly. It's too small to even make sense of it, but that really essentially saying that there is a big demographic with men, women, ethnicity, age, and look at the college education. Huge study. What we're also talking about now is what they talked about in terms of abuse. Over in the right-hand column, there are three kinds of abuse that they began to look at. One was emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. In the middle, they looked at household challenges. They identified 5: mother treated violently, household substance use, household mental illness, parental divorce or separation, or an incarcerated parent. And then neglect, emotional and physical neglect. So those are the categories of abuse. And again, there are the corresponding data and statistics, but what I really want you to see is this slide here. What we're invited to consider, what percentage, according to what you're seeing on the board, what percentage of that population had 0 adverse childhood experiences, or at least reported? Roughly a third. What that's code for, ladies and gentlemen, is 2/3 of that population had anywhere from 1 to 4 adverse childhood experiences. Put it in concrete terms, if each of you were to take out your phones right now, go to your phone directory, and with your eyes closed, randomly pull up 100 people. These data are pointing out that 65% of those people would have had 1 to 4 adverse childhood experiences, not uncommonly having the first one before the age of 10 years old. That's pretty striking. And because of other contexts, for example, gender, men in this world don't have the same permissions to emote as women. As I mentioned in another presentation I gave earlier today, I've been in private practice for many, many years, and the ones that I've seen have come in with depression. And I've assessed them, they confirm it. Others who I might interview confirm it. I will at some point say, well, Mrs. Smith, depression is part of your profile, but I need to ask you some additional questions, mostly centered around rage and anger. And likewise, a big, tall, strong guy, 6'4", 200, coming in with anger management issues, court referred. Again, I would do all of the assessing relative to impulse control, etc. He would acknowledge it, everybody I would interview would acknowledge it. And at some point I would say, okay, Mr. Smith, now that I have this profile, I need to double back and ask you more about sadness and depression. See, because a high percentage of my practice over the years, the women that I have seen were actually angry and not depressed. And some of those women had been treated before and on antidepressant medication. But they asked, why am I still depressed? One of the reasons is that you never were fully depressed. You were behaving in that way. But the issues that you really struggle with are anger and rage. But as I mentioned in an earlier presentation, were I to a woman to really get angry and to walk around putting her fists in walls and cursing like a sailor and calling you all sort of MFs, the first thing out of your mouth, including women, is that bee is crazy, totally discounting what she may be authentically feeling. And likewise, for a strong man to come in with anger issues, but for him to be crying, looking sad, and pouting, and he's a wimp and a sissy and a punk. he knows that, and so does she, so they have to find a socially acceptable way of talking about their journey. So when you add the context of gender, in professional sports, when you add the context of celebrity, celebrities are really buoyed up by their fans and they embrace that, so they really don't want that shine to come off the star. When you add in race, when you add in other dimensions, what you see in pro ball, particularly in basketball, they are incentivized to keep quiet, keep it tucked in, keep it tight. And because they want to capitalize on the opportunity, because of a whole range of other emotions, they in fact take that challenge to tuck it in and commit themselves to mastering their craft, i.e. in the case of Keon Dooley. So what we also know, a team of researchers, some of whom were at UCLA, did a follow-up study to the ACE study. And essentially one of their findings is that race, ethnicity, nationality, and gender were assessed as chronic burdens that they carry around. So in addition to the trauma, in addition to the other contexts that we talked about, race and ethnicity and nationality are burdens. And when you begin to look at the current socio-political climate, hopefully you can begin to understand that's part of the invisible arena that operates very powerfully, excuse me, and toxically within those communities. So then we have a little bit more. When we start looking at some of the work of scholars, Hardy and his colleagues, we start seeing that there is a notion that there is growth in trauma. That's really important to keep in mind. You'll never see a traumatic situation where there isn't growth as an opportunity. The silver lining in every dark cloud is echoed in the works of scholars such as Tedeschi, Calhoun, and Grillo. Snyder reminds us of the power of forgiveness and hope. Simon Jabisky and colleagues invite us to look at the overlooked relationship between motivation and post-traumatic stress. There's a lot of scholarship that supports that when you are having trauma, you turn that into the proverbial chip on your shoulder, and you use it as a marker to propel you forward. So we know these things to be true. I want you to, in your spare time, become familiar with this particular text, Trauma, Madness, and Mental Health Services. See, because part of what we're talking about and looking at this whole reason why athletes don't come for help, in addition to being gendered and celebrity, there's a whole notion within mental health about stigma, shame about coming forward, embarrassment about admitting the challenges you are facing, fear of looking differently in the eyes of other people. What Noel Hunter invites us to consider is that certainly education about mental health and wellness is important. One of the things we do in the National Basketball Players Association, Keon Doolin and I put together, with the help of our IT colleagues, a player access only website, the theme of which is mental health literacy. So at this point we have up to 90 links where players can click on and go to and learn about depression or gambling or substance use or relationship challenges, PTSD. So our goal in mental health literacy is to educate players to take care of themselves, to give them a language and a lens to which to understand their teammates and all their fellow fraternity members in the league. But in order to really get at this whole notion of stigma, I'm inviting all of you to at least invoke 3 other disciplines. You see, when you really look at the discipline of medicine as traditionally practiced, and particularly psychiatry, those models of psychiatry are rooted in notions of pathology. And pathology, ladies and gentlemen, is the study of disease. I won't go into the long history of all of that, but mark my words, that we are promoting disease and how do we repair disease, that's real different than the notion that there's some health involved here. But again, in order to understand stigma, you have to understand the menage a trois relationship between the insurance companies, which is the second one, the insurance companies, with the health and medical model, excuse me, the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies. So there's a huge relationship between the pathology model of medicine, the insurance companies, and the pharmaceutical companies. And in the book that I referred to earlier, they are, in fact, according to Noah Hunter, promoting medicalization of disease. Real important text. Victor Frankl, A Man Search for Himself, is a wonderful book, required in the class I teach in trauma. But it really talks about, even in the Holocaust, there was a way that he got through. So what are we really talking about in the end? I invite all athletes to address their personal struggles and support the journey of healing as we are open to Pandora's box. That's what the general notion is. And there's a lot of GMs, there are a lot of owners, we don't call them owners anymore, but CEOs of these teams. They really do believe that if you invite an athlete to start talking about their problems, you are in fact getting ready to open up Pandora's box. And while there's absolutely no evidence on the face of planet Earth to support that notion, it is in fact a believable notion. And so they are incentivized really not to say anything, because really to come out clean with what they are authentically feeling comes up with some real consequences, including significant financial. So a lot of time, again, there's incentive to stay quiet. But I encourage athletes, and another cornerstone of our program is that you aren't all opening up Pandora's box, but you are in fact opening up as a treasure chest of untapped genius and talent. And we see that every day and every way. So the implication of this is I always want you, that you next time you look at these ballers on TV, when you look at the athletes here in your own community, those who have chips on their shoulders, they really do believe that they do not want to let go of that chip, because it really is fueling their drive. At some level, I certainly would support them. Simultaneously, I would say, and how long is this chip going to be working? Let's begin to plan on the day when it no longer works. How can you begin to respond at that point? Because in the case of Keon, those tattoos always stay on, and you will never be aware of when you're going to be triggered. I also want people to pay attention to the smoke detector behavior. Next time you see somebody behaving badly, particularly an athlete, always understand that that behavior that you are looking at and witnessing may be problematic. Problematic meaning if it continues, there's going to be some consequences. But I invite you to consider that while a behavior may be problematic behavior is absolutely, take it to the bank, never the problem. The problem is always something else. There's a current athlete in today's media who lost $30 million contract based on his smoke detector behavior. And everybody was enamored with his absolutely gifted talent. But he's now been dislodged from a second team just up the road. His smoke detector behavior is very prevalent. I also encourage you to really begin to appreciate this ACE study. And again, while it may not apply to any of you in here, because I understand you're the perfect audience, it may apply to some friends. And one of the assignments I give my students in my trauma class, the very first day, you go over the syllabus, He said, your first assignment is to interview 2 trauma survivors. Then I go on to put the second, third, and fourth assignments on. And invariably, one of the students raised their hand and said, well, Dr. P, can you go back to number 1? What do you mean interview a trauma survivor? And very politely and professionally, I said, well, what's not clear about this? You have to interview 2 people. Well, where do I get 2 people from? I said, well, that's part of the homework. And invariably, in a self-reflection paper that they have to author, the issue of first was, who do I know as trauma? But the struggle that ultimately emerges is which one of the many people I know who report trauma will I select to interview? And who of that group admitted they do I have to say no to? I don't want to hear that story. That's the dilemma they face. So people's adverse experiences are everywhere. So how do we get to all of this? It is important to begin to look in your own self and engage in the art of reflection. As I mentioned in the presentation I said earlier, what I invite my students to memorize is a person will never see their reflection in running water. It is only when the water is still will their reflected image begin to emerge. To be still and to really ask yourself honestly, what's going on with me and what are the forces that have shaped my life? Understand, again, the social connection between stigma and the power to reframe the narrative. And what most people don't know about stigma, it's not just some illusionary feeling. It actually has some component parts. There is a power, quote unquote, that recognizes the differentiating behavior. Somebody says that that's wrong. And there's a devaluation of that individual, marking them with a tattoo or a mark. In contemporary times, you've heard of the scarlet letter. When Esther Prime did something wrong, it wasn't socially acceptable, so she got marked and had to walk around with this scarlet letter. So what we see in ancient times is the same thing. People who did poorly were actually tattooed. But that's where I got into this whole stigma. You have to look at the monopoly relationship between the models of pathology and the financial incentive models of insurance companies and pharmaceuticals. You'll see in the news there's a big pharmaceutical issue going on right now, the OxyContin. Many of our kids are dying, overdosing. And there are people who are making billions of dollars over selling sickness. Insurance companies are making profit hand over fist. So really talking about this, I think is going to be important. So the last thing I leave you with, that it's important ultimately to listen to yourself, to listen to the players and the athletes that you are working with. And listening is a very important skill. But as I mentioned early on with Jerry West being the logo of the NBA and hiding in plain sight is his call. The best way to listen is actually hidden in these 6 letters. So if you unscramble these 6 letters, what you come up with is the word silent. So the best way to listen to yourself and to listen to others is to really engage in self-reflection, be moment still and honest about what's going on in your life, what may be going on in life and the others, and never be a hater in judging other people and their experiences. Finally, I just want to leave you with a quote, is that there are wounds that never show on the body. They are deeper and more hurtful than anything that bleeds. Sometimes you don't see these invisible tattoos, but they are nonetheless present and influencing the behavior of the athletes that you live and breathe with every day and witness on TV. So again, thank you for your time, your attention, willingness to consider a fresh, authentic, and overdue look at the person behind the performer. Thank you, and I'll entertain any questions that you may have right now. Thank you.
I don't know that I need a microphone. How would you say ownership has perceived your work with the NBA players, the National Basketball Players Association? On one hand, it would seem they want to protect their investment, and so it's an investment in their organization. And on the other hand, they seem to fly in the face of the win at all costs perspective.
Yeah, I don't have any direct evidence that I have feedback directly from owners. I do have messaging from general managers, from coaches, who are really beginning to understand what we're talking about and seeing it. I think the owners aren't as on board as I think they will be. Because the issue is that I think you don't have to lose money. You, in fact, can make more money if you invest and not divest in one's mental health and wellness. So it's early in the game. Again, our program's only been up and running 15 months. And so my guess is we're actually just starting year number 2. We're going to add to what we already have. And so my guess at some point it'll be embraced, certainly at management level. And as you may be aware, well, I work at the NBPA, which is the union. The NBA has gone on record now at the start of this season. Training camp is starting in October. Every team has to have a licensed mental health professional, psychologist, or psychiatrist on staff on the team. All 30 teams. So owners had to buy into that. And so I think the message is clearer, but not as clear as it can be. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just a technical question. In the point that you just made about the increase, well, the number of mental health professionals who will be associated with each team, is the mental health and wellness program going to help facilitate? Because what you presented here is a new paradigm of trauma.
Right.
And the psychiatrists and mental health professionals that may be associated with the team haven't gotten on to this yet.
That's correct. And so the question
Is, will they be connected with the mental health and wellness program so everyone's on the same page?
yes and no, at some level, yes, in part because we know each other.
Okay.
But again, the Players Association and the league are very, very different. The Players Association was an organization that really started in 1954 in response to the conditions of play that were operative before them. So they weren't getting compensation correctly and per diems and all those sorts of things. And so they started a union and said, we're willing to ball and do what we're supposed to do, but we have to look at the bigger picture here. And so it has now grown into quite lucrative business. Again, the NBA is full of the owners. And given that there's only 450 active ballers in the league, and there's several thousand men who have the potential to be in the league, when you look at it from a strict business model, if somebody wants to go, there's several others who come in. So I think it remains to be seen how effective the combined program is. But at this point, they're entered as differently. But I will say, in fairness, that they are both represent two options for players. They can really tap into the resources on their team, or they can go outside. Because one of the components that we've developed, myself and Keon, is there are 30 teams, and so we have 32 teams. We have put a small directory of licensed mental health professionals in every city where there's an NBA team, and in Las Vegas where they have somebody. So if somebody were to, a player were to give us a call, or somehow come to our attention, let's say in LA where I'm from, that they would need some services. They would talk to me, I'd give them an assessment, and give them a couple of options of a vetted mental health practitioner there in our city that they would then see. And whatever they did, they are not on the retainer of the league or the PA. So however that practitioner practices, that really is between him or her and the player. And so we don't keep records, it's really what they do. So that's the difference, but I think it represents a second option for players, team, as well as outside. Any other questions, thoughts, or?
In one of your slides, you were talking about the idea that there's a hard transition to, I guess, civilian life for athletes.
Right.
Are there any sports teams that are recognizing that and trying to create programs for, let's say, the players are going to retire, or that are retired, and kind of like reaching out and saying, hey, how is the civilian life? What can we do to help you? Are there any sports teams that are recognizing that concern? Because I recognize that as a collegiate athlete, that transition for, especially when you've done it for 13, 14 years, then once you're done with it, you're just like, well, what do I do now?
The short answer is yes. The PA has a couple of programs, a career transition program. I believe the NFL and maybe Major League Baseball. I don't know as much about those programs, but that phenomenon has been studied and researched, and a lot of scholarship written for years. Both collegiate transition, but also in pros. And so, yeah, I think the system is aware of that, and there are some systems in place to address that. How effective those systems are is a different question, but I think that they are in place because I think it's a real issue. Yeah. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you talked about the two options that the players have outside of the team and inside of the team.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about maybe the benefits of going outside and having that work independently once it gets going, that relationship. What challenges, ethical or otherwise, do you see with services from the team themselves, and what might it take for that option or model to be successful and ethical?
The challenges with the program that we outlined and introduced in the PA, there are at this point more pluses than minuses, in that we really have vetted each provider. They've in fact been degreed, licensed, certified, credentialed, and they go through a vetting process that we put them through in the PA office. Part of which they have to have an active license, active malpractice insurance, and experience with athletes. But once they are there, they are not on retainer with us or the league. So if somebody came to you as a licensed professional, you would see them work on whatever issue, keep your notes, schedule your appointments. It really is your thing. I would need to know as a director if there was an issue of gun violence or spousal abuse, because then that gets into some other confidentiality, but with permission. That sort of information exchange makes sense and is really useful. So I think that there's a lot of pluses, because there's no way in that system where the CEO of the team, where the general manager, the coaches, even the players don't know what you're doing, but you're getting some professional help. The model with the NBA just started, like I said, they're just now bringing out on board this coming up season. I don't know the full mechanics of their actual contractual relationship. I do know in the past, some teams have had psychologists as consultants and or as paid staff who would come to their players saying, well, we're confidential, et cetera, But I also know many ballers who really understand and believe, sort of, that talking to the team shrink is going to be okay. But the minute they ask them who's paying your salary, and they say, well, executive leadership, they go, okay, thanks for the information. And they're less disclosing. Because there are real implications when stuff becomes public. In terms of financial costs, trade value, there's a whole system of dominoes that begin to fall. At least that's the perception. I think it has some validity. So there is evidence that players may be more resistant. But again, it really depends in large part on the relationship that the professional has with the team. I could see some teams really embracing that model and keeping everything in-house, and the management really not sweating the professional at all. And that system can work very beautifully. But the option is, and the key thing here is to make sure that the players have options. They have places to go to begin their journey of self-examination and I think all of that is a plus. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the question. You talked about stigma and getting over mental health stigma, and you talked about this mask and people, particularly men in particular, not sharing their emotions. Can you talk more about how you get beyond the mask and work with men to say it's okay to get help for these tattoos that they have?
I think there's a lot of scholarship about what I'm ready to say, but let me just sum it up in saying I think part of what you have to do is really capitalize on your relationship. So relational capital goes a long way. It's certainly true in the pro sports that people don't really care how much you know until they really know how much you care. And you really have to show that you care. Because in a fraternity such as the NBA, where players are groomed to watch out for people who are always wanting something from them, they're very guarded and protective of themselves. And that guardedness and protection also applies to professionals coming in to quote unquote help them. So at some point needing to capitalize on your relationship with them, develop trust, and help them discover that you are actually on their side is a first step. The second is really limiting your statements that say, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, because you really don't. I think it's safer to say, I can't begin to imagine how you're feeling, but I would like to know if you'd like to share that with me. And together we can sort of solve this puzzle. So there's ways of approaching that that's important. And the key tool often used is one of reframing, really getting them a different perspective. So one of the images I give my students in class, I say, if you had a bow and arrow and you loaded the arrow onto the bow and pulled it back slightly, the arrow's not going to go very far. But if you load up the arrow and keep pulling the bow back and back and back and back, akin to life's setbacks, and then you let that arrow go, it's going to travel farther than you ever hoped, dreamed, or desired. So teaching them that a setback is code for a setup for impending success. So that's just one of several ways of reframing the experience that they're going through. If you give them some alternative ways of viewing the situation that they're in, they often make choices to take that journey with you. Other questions, comments, or thoughts? Yes.
I think it's so interesting, the notion that you hear so many times that there is a sense of growth with trauma. But then you have someone like Frederick Douglass that said, without struggle, there can be no progress. So to what extent is someone allowed to face trauma, where, again, you have that struggle, but it isn't so traumatic where it takes away their ability to be human or to express just being a human being, if that makes sense.
No, I didn't quite get the last part of what you were saying.
Oh, you get, so it's just,
Could you repeat what the question?
yeah, so it's just, to what extent, and what are some examples of traumatic experiences or moments of struggle that I guess are acceptable, if they are, if we know that without struggle there can be no progress, or without traumatic experience there really can't be no growth? Because you hear that over and over and over again, and that's something that I read Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl repeats that over and over.
Correct. I don't know that you can, as intellectual and as calm as you may receive that information, that right now, while you have an intellectual understanding, if some traumatic thing happened into your life within the next week, God forbid, I don't know that you'd be intellectually on board to say, okay, I'm going to get some growth out of this. You'd be so wiped out, depending on what it was. And at some point you would get around to surrendering to, okay, this sucks, but I can get to a different space. But I don't know that you can be so gifted with this academic knowledge of growth that somehow that can dull the impact of what you're experiencing. One could argue that the depth of the experience is really a testament to your attachment in your relationship to whatever it is you attached to. And breaking apart, coming unglued, feeling the pain is actually a sign that your body is working. See, one of the things, for example, medical model tells us, if you were to skin your leg right now, it stings, it would bleed. And the first thing out of your mouth is, how do I stop the pain? And all of that makes sense. But if you were to fall down and skin your knee and not feel any pain, and not feel the blood trickling, that is the problem. So the fact that you are in pain tells you that your body is working, not that it's not working. Any of you ever had a cold or a flu and had a fever and chills? And that just sucks like you wouldn't believe. And it always happens at the wrong time. And at one level, though, it's an indication that your body is working. And it's telling you need to pay attention to it. And so if you learn how to talk to your body differently, understand and reframe life's existential challenges differently, develop a sense of your own agency and ability to handle whatever comes down the pipe, I think you will be ahead of the game. But I don't know of anybody, any human, if they're human, can be so intellectually knowledgeable about trauma that they won't get slammed to the curb. I just don't know if that's ever true. Any final thoughts or questions before we wind down? Going once, going twice. Well, thank you again. You've been very kind, and I appreciate you.